Over 60, top 6 seafood choices that strengthen your eyes. Now here's something that may surprise you. 99% of people over 60 have no idea that what they put on their plate could mean the difference between clear vision and vision loss. Most folks assume eye problems are just part of aging, something you can't avoid. Others swear by vitamins or prescription treatments but overlook the power of simple, everyday foods. So who's right? Is it true that the food you eat could be as important as the glasses you wear? Or is that just another health myth? Stick with me because the science might shock you. I've spent decades studying how nutrition impacts the aging eye, and I can tell you this, there are specific nutrients that act like shields for your vision. The good news? Some of the richest sources are hiding in the seafood aisle. These foods don't just taste great. They're packed with compounds that can help protect against macular degeneration, ease dry eye, sharpen night vision, and even reduce eye fatigue. And here's the kicker, most people never hear this from their doctor. So in today's video, we're counting down the top 6 seafood choices that strengthen your eyes after 60. You'll discover which tiny fish can cut your risk of blindness in half, which shellfish is loaded with a nutrient your retina can't survive without, and which popular seafood contains one of the most powerful antioxidants ever discovered, thousands of times stronger than vitamin C. But before we dive into the details, do me a quick favor. If you care about protecting your vision and staying independent as you age, hit that like button, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel. Every click gives us the motivation to bring you more life-changing, science-backed health tips. All right, let's get started. Because the first food on this list might already be in your pantry, and once you learn what it does for your eyes, you'll never look at it the same way again. Why eyes weaken after 60? Before we get to the seafood itself, let's talk about what actually happens to your eyes as you age. Most people think vision loss is just part of getting older, but the reality is more specific. The 3 most common age-related conditions are macular degeneration, cataracts, and issues like dry eye or glaucoma. Macular degeneration, or AMD, is the leading cause of blindness in older adults because it damages the macula, the part of your retina responsible for sharp, central vision. Reading, driving, and even recognizing faces all depend on a healthy macula. According to the Bright Focus Foundation, more than 11 million Americans are currently living with AMD, and that number is expected to double by 2050. Cataracts are another major problem. By age 80, more than half of all Americans either have a cataract or have had cataract surgery. It's like trying to see through a fogged-up window, and it happens largely because oxidative stress accelerates the natural clouding of the lens. Then there's dry eye and glaucoma. Dry eye may sound minor, but anyone who's experienced burning, itching, or that gritty sensation knows how disruptive it can be. Glaucoma, often called the silent thief of sight, slowly damages the optic nerve without symptoms until much of your vision is gone. CDC reports about 3 million Americans have glaucoma, and half of them don't even know it. So why do these problems become so common after 60? 2 main reasons. First, oxidative stress increases. Your eyes are exposed to light and oxygen every single day, and over decades that constant exposure creates free radicals that damage the delicate tissues of the retina and lens. Antioxidants usually protect against this, but as we get older, we simply don't have as many defenses in place. Second, nutrient absorption declines. Even if you're eating well, your body isn't as efficient at pulling vitamins and minerals out of your food. For example, lower stomach acid makes it harder to absorb zinc and vitamin B12, both of which are crucial for vision. The good news is that your eyes are highly responsive to nutrition. They are what I like to call hungry organs. Feed them the right nutrients and they respond. That's where seafood plays such an important role. Unlike most foods, seafood delivers a rare combination of compounds your eyes depend on. Omega-3 fatty acids that reduce inflammation and support the retina, zinc that helps transport vitamin A to protect night vision, selenium that fights oxidative damage, taurine that prevents retinal cell death, and astaxanthin, one of the most powerful antioxidants known, which improves circulation and guards against eye fatigue. So let me ask you this, what would it mean to delay cataracts by even a few years? Or to cut your risk of macular degeneration nearly in half? Would it give you more confidence behind the wheel, more independence at home, or simply more joy in seeing the faces of the people you love? I can tell you from decades of working with patients, you have more control over your eyesight than you've been told. And that's why in the next chapter, we'll look at the 6 seafood choices that can give your eyes exactly what they need to stay stronger, sharper, and healthier well past 60. Seafood number 6, tuna, the omega-3 and lutein duo. Tuna is one of the best foods you can add to your diet if you want to protect your eyesight after 60. Yellowfin and albacore tuna are especially rich in omega-3 fatty acids, and among these, DHA stands out. DHA is not just another fat, it's a structural component of your retina, where vision actually begins. Without enough DHA, the light-sensitive cells in your eyes struggle to function, and over time this can make age-related problems worse. Research backs this up. A 2019 study in investigative ophthalmology and visual science showed that people who consumed higher levels of omega-3 had a 38% lower risk of developing advanced macular degeneration. Another long-term study in JAMA ophthalmology found that older women who ate fish like tuna at least once a week had a 42% lower risk of AMD compared to those who rarely ate it. These aren't small numbers, they represent a significant difference in how well you see as you age. But omega-3s are only part of the story. Tuna also contains lutein and zeaxanthin, two powerful pigments that act as natural filters for your eyes. They protect the macula by absorbing harmful blue light and neutralizing oxidative stress. If you've ever noticed glare while driving at night or eye strain after a day of screen time, these nutrients are exactly what your eyes need. I've seen this firsthand with my patients. Mary, a 67-year-old retired teacher, came to me complaining that her evening crossword puzzles were becoming difficult because the letters looked fuzzy. Instead of rushing her into treatment, we adjusted her meals to include tuna steaks twice a week and more leafy greens for added lutein. Within a few months, she noticed less eye strain and sharper vision. Another patient, Harold, age 71, worked long hours on the computer and constantly rubbed his eyes from fatigue. When he replaced his usual lunch with tuna salad sandwiches a few times a week, his symptoms improved noticeably. These small, practical changes show that food can be just as powerful as medicine when it comes to protecting vision. Of course, many people worry about mercury in tuna, and that's a valid concern. My advice is simple. Choose light tuna instead of white albacore because it comes from smaller fish with lower mercury levels. Canned light tuna in water is both affordable and safe for most older adults, especially when eaten once or twice a week. So here's the question I often ask my patients. What if a simple meal, something as ordinary as a tuna sandwich, could be part of your eye care plan? Because it can. Tuna isn't just protein on your plate, it's fuel for your vision, a natural way to support the health of your retina, and a small step that can help you continue reading, driving, and seeing the faces you love with clarity. Seafood number 5, mussels, nature's taurine source. Mussels may not be the first food you think of when it comes to eye health, but they should be. Beyond their rich flavor, mussels are one of the most concentrated natural sources of taurine. Taurine is an amino acid, and in the retina it is absolutely essential. More than half of the free amino acids in the retina are taurine, and without it, the cells that process light begin to break down. In fact, studies in both animals and humans have shown that taurine deficiency can accelerate retinal degeneration, and if left unchecked, may lead to permanent vision loss. That's how vital it is. Research published in the Journal of Neuroscience highlighted taurine's protective role, showing that it helps stabilize cell membranes in the retina and shields them against oxidative stress. Another study from the University of Lyon in France found that taurine supplementation slowed down the progression of retinal degeneration in older adults. These findings confirm what I've seen in my own clinic. Taurine is not optional, it's a lifeline for aging eyes. One patient of mine, Jonathan, a 70-year-old retired engineer, came in worried about early signs of macular degeneration. Instead of rushing toward aggressive interventions, we focused on food first. I suggested he try mussels once a week. Not only did he enjoy the change in his diet, but at his follow-up visit, his eye scans showed less progression than his specialist had expected. That's the kind of outcome that reminds me why nutrition should always be part of the conversation. And Jonathan isn't the only one. A woman in her late 60s, Carol, struggled with frequent eye fatigue and complained of difficulty adjusting her eyes from sunlight to indoor lighting. When she began adding mussels and other taurine-rich seafood to her meals, she reported a noticeable improvement within weeks. Her eyes felt less strained, and she could enjoy reading again without constantly pausing to rest her vision. Of course, taurine isn't the only nutrient mussels bring to the table. They're also loaded with zinc and vitamin B12, both of which are critical for nerve function in the eye. Zinc helps transport vitamin to the retina, supporting night vision, while B12 maintains the health of the optic nerve itself. For older adults, deficiencies in either of these nutrients are common, and mussels provide a natural, delicious way to fill the gap. So let me ask you this. When was the last time you thought of a bowl of mussels not just as a treat, but as a tool to protect your eyesight? Mussels steamed with garlic and olive oil aren't just a heart-healthy dish, They are an investment in your vision. Adding them to your diet once or twice a week could be the difference between gradual decline and maintaining the sharpness you depend on. For anyone over 60, that's a small but powerful choice worth making. Seafood number 4, sardines, the tiny powerhouses. Sardines may look modest on the outside, but when it comes to nutrition, they are absolute giants, especially for eye health. These little fish are rich in selenium, vitamin D, and omega-3 fatty acids, 3 nutrients that work together to protect your vision. Selenium is a powerful antioxidant that shields delicate eye tissue from oxidative stress, the very process that accelerates age-related vision problems. Vitamin D helps calm inflammation in the eye, which is often at the root of conditions like dry eye and even macular degeneration. And of course, sardines are packed with omega-3s, which strengthen the retina and support the overall function of your visual system. The science here is compelling. A study in the British Journal of Ophthalmology found that adults who ate oily fish like sardines at least once a week had a 50% lower risk of developing wet macular degeneration compared to those who rarely ate them. That is not a small difference. It's a protective effect that could mean years of sharper, more reliable vision. Another report from the National Eye Institute echoed these findings, showing that consistent intake of omega-3-rich fish lowered the risk of late-stage AMD in older adults. I've seen these benefits firsthand. Helen, one of my patients in her early 70s, came to me after losing interest in cooking elaborate meals. She lived alone, and most nights she reached for packaged foods out of convenience. I suggested something simple: sardines on whole-grain toast with a squeeze of lemon. Affordable, easy, and nutrient-packed. After 6 months, her eye doctor was impressed, telling her that her scans looked better than many of his other patients the same age. She told me she felt more confident reading at night and even had more energy during the day. Another patient, Frank, 74, used to complain about his eyes feeling tired and watery after gardening. He didn't want supplements or complex diets, so we tried canned sardines a few times a week. Within a few months, he noticed not only less eye irritation, but also an improvement in his blood pressure. A bonus benefit thanks to the omega-3s. Sardines are also practical. They're inexpensive, widely available, and easy to store. Choosing sardines packed in olive oil gives you an extra layer of protection for your heart and eyes, since olive oil itself contains anti-inflammatory compounds. For anyone who struggles to plan meals or doesn't like to cook, sardines are a straightforward solution. So here's something to think about. If a $2 can of sardines could cut your risk of vision loss in half, why wouldn't you make it a regular part of your diet? Sometimes the smallest, simplest foods carry the greatest protection, and sardines are living proof of that. Seafood number 3, salmon, the omega-3 king. Salmon has earned its reputation as a superstar for eye health, and with good reason. It is one of the richest natural sources of EPA and DHA, 2 forms of omega-3 fatty acids that play a direct role in protecting vision. DHA, in particular, is found in high concentrations in the retina, where it helps maintain the structure and function of light-sensitive cells. Without enough of it, the retina becomes more vulnerable to degeneration. These fats are critical for preventing dry eye syndrome, supporting tear production, and lowering the risk of macular degeneration, which remains one of the leading causes of vision loss in older adults. The research on salmon is compelling. The Women's Health Study, which tracked nearly 40,000 women, found that those who ate fish twice a week had a 42% reduced risk of developing advanced macular degeneration compared to women who ate less than 1 serving a month. Another large study published in Archives of Ophthalmology confirmed similar findings, showing that older adults with higher omega-3 intake had a significantly lower chance of progression to late-stage AMD. Beyond AMD, omega-3s have also been linked to reduced risk of diabetic retinopathy, another vision-threatening condition common in seniors. I've seen these benefits firsthand with my patients. One gentleman in his late 60s came to me complaining of constant eye irritation and watery eyes, classic symptoms of dry eye. Instead of relying solely on artificial tears, we added salmon to his diet twice a week. Within a few months, he noticed that his eyes felt more comfortable, and he wasn't reaching for his eye drops nearly as often. Another patient, Susan, 72, was worried about her family history of macular degeneration. She made a habit of preparing baked salmon with vegetables every Sunday dinner, and over the years her eye exams have remained stable, much to her relief. Salmon also offers additional nutrients that support vision. It's a good source of vitamin D, which helps regulate inflammation, and astaxanthin, the antioxidant pigment that gives salmon its pink color, has been shown to protect retinal cells from oxidative stress. This means salmon works on multiple levels, reducing inflammation, nourishing the retina, and fighting off free radical damage. When choosing salmon, I always advise my patients to go for wild-caught whenever possible. Wild salmon tends to contain more omega-3s and fewer contaminants compared to farmed varieties. It can be grilled, baked, poached, or even enjoyed smoked on whole-grain crackers for a quick, healthy snack. So here's something worth asking yourself. If adding salmon to your meals just once or twice a week could keep your eyes clearer, more comfortable, and better protected against degeneration, why wouldn't you make that choice? For me, even in my 70s, it remains one of the simplest and most enjoyable prescriptions I give myself, and one I recommend to every patient who values their vision. Seafood number 2, oysters, the zinc superstars. When it comes to protecting your eyes, zinc is one of the most critical minerals you can get, and oysters are hands down the best natural source. Zinc is essential for moving vitamin A from your liver to the retina, where it helps create melanin, the pigment that shields your eyes from light damage. Without enough zinc, night vision begins to decline, and the risk of developing age-related macular degeneration increases significantly. The landmark ARDS trial conducted by the National Eye Institute proved this point clearly. Participants who took zinc as part of their daily supplement reduced the progression of macular degeneration by up to 25%. That's a meaningful difference when you think about preserving your independence and your ability to read, drive, or recognize faces. The science doesn't stop there. A study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that older adults with higher zinc intake had better visual function, particularly in low-light conditions, compared to those with lower intake. Another analysis showed that zinc deficiency was far more common in older adults with macular degeneration than in those without it. These findings make one thing clear: zinc isn't just helpful, it's essential. I've seen this play out with my patients. Robert, age 74, always thought oysters were an indulgence, something reserved for vacations or special dinners. But once he learned how rich they were in zinc, he began enjoying them once or twice a month. Over time, his blood work showed improved zinc levels, and he noticed he wasn't straining as much to see in dim light. He also told me he felt more energetic, a bonus effect since zinc supports immune health and energy metabolism as well. Another patient, Linda in her late 60s, avoided seafood altogether until she developed early signs of AMD. After working oysters, sometimes fresh, sometimes canned, into her diet, she noticed less trouble reading in the evenings, and her follow-up eye scans showed slower progression than expected. Oysters are also rich in copper and selenium, two other nutrients that work alongside zinc to protect the retina. This makes them one of the most complete eye-friendly foods available. If fresh oysters are hard to find where you live, canned oysters are an excellent alternative. They're convenient, affordable, and still packed with the nutrients your eyes need. So let me ask you this. If something as simple as a few servings of oysters each month could help you hold on to your vision longer, would you think of them as indulgence or as insurance for your eyes? Sometimes the foods we treat as luxuries turn out to be some of the smartest choices we can make for our long-term health. Seafood number 1, shrimp. The astaxanthin secret. Shrimp may be small, but when it comes to eye health, they carry one of the most powerful nutrients you can find, astaxanthin. This red-orange pigment, also found in krill and certain algae, is one of the strongest antioxidants known to science, with studies showing it can be up to 6,000 times more potent than vitamin C. What makes astaxanthin so special is its ability to cross both the blood-brain barrier and the blood-retina barrier, meaning it can reach the most delicate tissues in the eye where other antioxidants cannot. Once there, it helps improve blood flow to the retina, reduce oxidative stress, and protect against eye fatigue, all of which are critical for aging eyes. Several studies highlight these benefits. Research published in Ophthalmology Times Japan showed that participants who took astaxanthin experienced better accommodation ability, the capacity of the eye to shift focus between near and far objects. For seniors who struggle with reading a book and then looking up at the television, this improvement can feel like night and day. Another clinical trial reported that astaxanthin supplementation reduced symptoms of digital eye strain, such as dryness and blurred vision, which are common complaints among older adults who spend time on phones or computers. I've seen these effects firsthand in my patients. One gentleman in his early 70s loved woodworking but complained that after an hour in his shop, his eyes felt heavy and tired. When he began adding shrimp to his meals a couple of times a week, combined with more leafy greens, he noticed he could work longer without eye fatigue. Another patient, a retired librarian, said she often struggled to refocus after reading for long periods. After making shrimp salads a regular part of her lunch, she reported that the transition from reading to watching television became smoother, with less blur. Shrimp also has practical advantages beyond astaxanthin. It's naturally low in calories, high in protein, and provides selenium and vitamin B12, both important for nerve health and antioxidant defense. And unlike some larger fish, shrimp is considered a low-mercury seafood, making it a safe option for older adults to eat regularly. Whether tossed into a stir-fry, added to a fresh salad, or mixed into pasta with olive oil and vegetables, shrimp is as versatile as it is beneficial. So here's something to consider. If one simple ingredient can sharpen your focus, reduce eye fatigue, and improve the circulation that keeps your vision clear, why not make it part of your weekly routine? Sometimes the strongest protection for your eyes doesn't come from a supplement bottle. It comes from a plate of shrimp, served at your dinner table. So let's wrap this up. We've covered the top 6 seafood choices that strengthen your eyes after 60, from tuna loaded with omega-3s and lutein, to mussels rich in taurine, sardines packed with selenium and vitamin D, salmon as the king of omega-3s, oysters overflowing with zinc, and finally shrimp with its powerhouse antioxidant, astaxanthin. What's the takeaway? Your eyesight isn't just about age, it's about nourishment. The foods you eat can slow down degeneration, protect against fatigue, and keep your vision sharper for longer. Think of seafood not just as dinner, but as natural eye medicine, simple, delicious, and available at your local store. Now ask yourself, if adding a few servings of these foods each week could help you see more clearly, drive more safely, and enjoy the faces of your loved ones without struggle, why wait? Your eyes deserve that care. Thank you so much for watching. If you found value in today's video, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every click helps us keep creating honest, science-backed health tips designed to keep you strong, sharp, and independent after 60. Take care of your eyes, and I'll see you in the next video.